You're watching Fugitive Red Eye, and welcome to another book review. And once again, it's another political book written by another host of the Daily Wire, as was the last one. Last time I reviewed Michael Knowles' book, Speechless. Today I'll be reviewing Matt Walsh's book, The Unholy Trinity, Blocking the Left's Assault Against Life, Marriage, and Gender, from 2017. Matt Walsh has very easily become my favorite Daily Wire host, because I really like his dry, deadpan sense of humor he has. He also tends to have the best put-together arguments, I feel, when it comes to abortion and transgenderism. I mean, I already agreed with him on these things, but I think he does a very good job articulating these things and pointing out the root problems with a lot of these, and really breaking down why there's no logical sense in these things. So this book is primarily about, as you could probably guess from the title, abortion, transgenderism, and marriage. Specifically, the idea that marriage is between a man and a woman, and not gay marriage. He also does touch on euthanasia, which is something I have very mixed feelings about. On the one hand, I do agree that it sets a dangerous precedent, where a doctor believes that something is not worth living through. If he's treating a patient with stage 4 cancer, and then agrees with that patient that their life isn't worth fighting for, and then another patient wants to fight for it, he's going to have a hard time being motivated to do that. I also do think that it is dangerous if other people were to make those decisions for you. But I also do think that there is a certain degree that I actually am okay with euthanasia, if it's the patient's idea, and they're terminally ill, and stuff like that. So it's a complicated issue for me, but he does touch on that in the book as well. The first 2 points, right? Abortion and transgenderism, I was already completely on board from the start. I already agree with those. But it is good to get more information on it anyway. And he makes great arguments, and it's a very interesting listen. As far as the marriage issue, I do agree that the definition of marriage specifically was defined for a very specific type of relationship between men and women. That said, it's not something I actually care about, because with the current dating scene and the way people are now, I don't really have the biggest faith in the concept of marriage. It's not really something that I really care about. I really don't believe in romance, per se. I'm very cynical when it comes to that. So that's one that, though I do agree that by definition it was specifically that thing, it's not something that I actually care about. That said, it was still interesting listening to his points, and he did bring up, cases where people were forced to do things they didn't agree with, like bakers being forced to make cakes for gay weddings and things like that, which I think is ridiculous. You should not be forced to do something you don't want to do. And, they weren't even discriminating, saying, oh, we won't serve a gay guy. What they were doing was saying, I'm not going to take part in a ceremony that I don't agree with. But it's there's tons of bakers. There's plenty of people who will do it. Just go somewhere else. Stop suing people and being a piece of shit. We live in such a litigious time where people like to just sue people for arbitrary things like that, so that really pisses me off. It's a very good book. He does, go over some historical precedent with things and how things got the way they are, but it is much more focused on just tackling how these ideas get pushed, the danger they have to society, and it points out the importance of language, because, one of the biggest problems we run into now, especially with the transgender movement, is the redefining of language. Because initially they said gender and sex are different, which was already just a way to get their foot in the door. It was complete non sequitur in the first place. But nowadays, these activists don't even like to say the gender and sex are different argument, because they try to say that biological sex doesn't exist and that there's no physical difference between a man and a woman, which is just absolutely asinine and not based in any sort of actual factual reality. Because the concept of gender, as it's currently defined now, is make-believe. And they can't define it. Hence why Matt Walsh himself has started, the whole what is a woman movement, which I think is great, because leftists just cannot define what a woman is. So even though a lot of them are very, big on identifying as a woman, they can't even articulate what the fuck they're identifying as. Because it doesn't mean anything in this context. When, obviously, you ask someone on the right, we'll easily tell you, adult human female, then they'll be like, what's female? Someone, typically with XX chromosomes, who contains female reproductive organs, such as a vagina, ovaries, etc. Whether or not they can or can give birth. And typically, now, Matt Walsh uses, of the sex that typically has organs designed to give birth, which, yes, But I think I like to narrow it down more just because they can't use the, oh, but what if you're deficient argument, which granted he tackles that in the book too excellently because it's a deficiency. It's not a completely different thing. Like a woman who can't give birth, there's something wrong with her organs. Whereas men specifically are not designed to give birth. Very different thing. Yeah, I really liked this book. I liked it a lot more than Speechless, I think, mainly because I think this one is one that I agreed with most of the underlying premise, whereas Speechless was one that, although I like Michael Knowles and I did agree with a lot of the logic in the book, and it was good hearing the historical stuff on it, I fundamentally disagreed with some of the basic premises in that one. Though I will say, much like Michael Knowles, Matt Walsh is hardcore Catholic, so I do disagree with him fundamentally on a few things, such as porn and a few things like that. He's much more puritanical in that regard, and has thoughts that I wouldn't agree with in that regard, but in the context of this book, the only thing I mainly disagree with is maybe just how religious some of it can be in the book. But even then, he doesn't base the whole thing on religion. He uses a lot of points that are based in reality, and he also does have some stuff that he brings in religion, but again, that's just one of his many things that he brings into it. And to be clear, I do think that Judeo-Christian religion was very important in forming our moral framework as a society, and I ultimately think that's very important, and I also wouldn't necessarily call myself an atheist. I'm not religious. I'd like to consider myself more agnostic, but still I do think Matt Walsh is much more obviously religious than I would be in this, so he does bring that in. But again, it's only one factor when he has many, many good points that don't involve religion at all. This one I agreed with basically the whole thing. The only thing is with marriage, I'm not someone who actually really cares about marriage. And I honestly, at the end of the day, don't care if gay people get married because I don't really care about marriage. But I understand the arguments there. Like, to be clear, I do think that the ideal household for kids to grow up in is a married man and woman. I do think that is the ideal. So I do think that's important. I'm just not a big believer in marriage, especially in current times. But I do think if you're raising children, being a married man and woman is the best scenario. But the first 2 points with abortion and transgenderism, I completely 100% agree with him. He goes over, statistics with abortion and the rise in it, and, suicidality with transgenderism. Basically, it is a lot of things I'm sure most of us on the right already either know or agree with on some level. But I think that it is still a really good book. It was very interesting, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. I really enjoyed that. I really like Matt Walsh. And it's a good book. I highly recommend it. This has been Fugitive Red Eye. Have a good one. Toodles.